The Ease of Control, Part 2. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. This is a rather niche aspect of my work, but I know from the comments in the first part that there are those of you who are very much interested in this, and you really ought to be, because it's providing you with a deep dive and insight into the way that my mind works. Of course, it'll be too heavy for certain people, and there we are. But you will benefit from persevering with this, not only just in terms of understanding the way that I look at the world, but also understanding the way that control is obtained. I'm going to continue providing you with my observations with regard to understanding how people regard death, because to understand their attitude and responses to death enables me to increase my ability to control them, to really get under the skin, to move amongst those synapses in their brain, to intermingle within their thoughts, to take hold of that fear and utilize it. I'd explained how philosophers had looked at the issue of death, how existentialists had done so. But what about from an anthropological perspective? Arnold van Gennep looked at the model of death with regard to the rites of passage, that it was analysed by evolutionists, and within that a French sociological school and a British functionalist school. As to the psychological perspective, this focused on the discussion of the meaning of death, individual and social responses to death, individual differences in responses to loss, contextual influences on grief and bereavement, as well as the developmental aspects of death at the different stages of life. It's important to understand that victims are not fixed at the point of death as to their view of it, but rather it is an evolving thing. Ask a child what their view of death is, it'll be completely different from their view when you ask them that question in their late 20s, and again when you ask them perhaps when they're in their 40s, when they have children of their own, and again when they're in their 60s. And therefore it's important to understand the way and the different layers that people see death at different stages of their life. A sociological focus looked at death as a measure of life, differences between societies and their views of death, death as a mechanism of social control, institutional influences on cultural death systems, memorialization, collective immortality, and symbolic immortality. It enables me to understand the social status and experiences of those who die or are dying. Is there a stigma that's associated with death and dealing with it? How do people respond to it? Grief. How they address bereavement. What is the status of those who survive? Back in 1969, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross published On Death and Dying, and that was a landmark publication with regard to contemporary psychological thanatology. It actually began a public discussion about dying and death, and created consideration of how people ought to be supported with regard to people who are dying and their families. One of the most significant aspects that came out of it, which I found fascinating with regard to enabling me to understand more about people's attitudes towards death, was the creation of a concept of the stages of dying, which outlined the 6 persons' attitude towards death. Fascinating to me that the multiplicity of stages of dying reflected the emotional state of the patient. Naturally, emotional experiences are integral to one such as I, because I feed upon them because of my narcissism. My intellectual curiosity is a little akin to looking at a bug underneath the plate, under a microscope. A curiousness about the responses, a detached amusement with regard to the way that human beings respond to all of the things that come their way in life, but especially when the Grim Reaper makes his appearance. You'll be familiar with some of these aspects that arose in relation to Kubler-Ross's publication. The first, of course, is denial. And that is of particular interest to me with regard to the issue of control, because, of course, the narcissist utilises denial as the first line of defence out of the twin lines of defence for the narcissist. To understand, therefore, how denial operates with regard to the concept of dying is truly very interesting. Essentially, I observed as an individual would look to find an excuse to undermine the credibility of cold, hard evidence about the incurable disease. I found it fascinating that when confronted with clear evidence which tells somebody you have a disease that cannot be cured, you're going to die, that somehow they deny the efficacy of that information, that they state that it is wrong, that they seek to undermine it in some way, that they look for some kind of escape from it, that they are convinced that the disease can't actually affect them. Of course, such a response is that of delusion, but not in the sense of the way that a narcissist functions, but rather in terms of just not wanting to think that they could be affected by it. I noticed that this individual often makes the manifestation of attitudes only when there are other people with whom they establish contact, and then adapt them to their expectations. That person simulates well-being in front of those who don't accept the condition, and then opens up interaction with those who accept the condition. This piece of knowledge was particularly useful to me, whereby I could understand that if I stated to them, no, you can't be dying, no, that just isn't the case, that they end up mirroring that stance. Whereas the opportunity to say, yes, I accept that you're going to die, will cause them to behave in a similar way. I found it most interesting to find myself being mirrored. Thus, denial was useful in understanding more about this attitude towards death. Then came the second stage, anger. It's not necessarily the case that I have seen these stages occur in the exact order by which I described them. There are those whereby in Kubler-Ross's material it's stated that it does follow this exact order. My experience is not that. The main thing for me was to understand how people would respond so that I could then use that with regard to my control over that individual and, of course, others. And thus, anger would arise. I've written about in Fury how anger is, in some instances, a healthy response to certain situations, and that there are instances that becoming angry is entirely logical. Often it's not logical to remain angry, and in some situations it isn't logical to be angry in the first place. But here anger made an appearance with regard to the issue of impending death, and the individual shows anger, resentment. The victims of this anger, of course, are the various bystanders, usually medical personnel, but also family and loved ones. I observed that the dying individual treats them with indifference, without joy, and with irritability, and sometimes with considerable anger, provoking conflict and creating difficulties for those carers, which of course provided me with opportunity. The third stage is bargaining. The individual is aware of their state of health and the seriousness of the situation, and then seeks to bargain. Most commonly, I've witnessed that this is with God, that they bargain for the prolongation of life, that therefore they want to offer a change of attitude and behaviour, for instance, dedicating themselves to the church as some kind of futile attempt to postpone the death. I found this most amusing, that somehow the individual, falling into a delusion, suddenly believes that an imaginary being is going to grant them longer on this planet as a consequence of them now changing their mind. If I were that being and that decision maker, it would be a simple, "Oh, so now you come to me when you want something. Fuck you, you're going to die." But of course, this desire to bargain, to get more time on the planet, again provided opportunity, both in terms of understanding and also to utilize that to my advantage, perhaps by offering hope. Many of you will know my attitude with regard to hope, that I regard her as a false mistress. However, I always explain that you should look to action and not to hope. But hope is something that many empathic victims cling on to. And who would I be but a poor narcissistic psychopath if I didn't exploit that? And thus, learning about the need to bargain was particularly instructive in understanding attitudes towards death to assist with the ease of control. The fourth stage is depression, where the individual is particularly in a stage of long-term illness. There's a loss of strength, a loss of beauty, the loss of the capability to self-service. This condition deepens with the awareness that death is edging closer, and therefore is wrapped up in the denial, the anger and the bargaining, until the final acceptance. The final stage is acceptance. The patient doesn't show any jealousy towards the living and healthy any longer, and they accept their fate. They look towards their impending death with quiet anticipation, something which provides the opportunity for discussion. They often wonder about what comes next, which provides a further opportunity for exploitation. I found also that at this stage, the individual who's contemplating death where they know their own is coming, is that they then become wistful about those that have been lost, those who have gone before them, which provides opportunities for triangulation. That many want their presence even though those people have gone, or that where they are living, that there are repeated demands placed for those individuals to come forth. Again, something which can be utilized. That, of course, is looking, from what Kubler-Ross explained, with regard to an individual who knows that death is coming towards them, as opposed to a more abstract general appreciation of it. Very useful in terms of understanding this for the ease of control. I shall continue with my observations about death, how people regard it, and how I have used that and those beliefs and those attitudes with regard to the ease of control. Join me in part 3.